The giant crystal dome of the Galactic Council stretched high above the meeting floor like a frozen ocean wave. Admiral Kim Day walked slowly across the smooth white surface toward the speaking platform, his black uniform with its simple earth. Insignia looked plain next to the colorful robes and shining armor worn by alien representatives from across the galaxy. Kim Day had been preparing for this moment for 3 months, ever since Earth received the invitation to present their military doctrine to the Council. Most species waited decades or even centuries before being allowed to share their war strategies with the galactic community. Earth had only been a council member for 3 years, which made this invitation both an honor and a test. The speaking platform rose from the floor as Kim Day approached it. Hundreds of alien eyes turned toward him from the circular seating arrangement that surrounded the center stage. Some species looked almost human, while others appeared as floating energy beings or insect-like creatures with multiple arms and glowing eyes. The diversity of the galaxy was on full display, but Kim Day could sense the same emotion from all of them. Doubt Counselor Vex Tar from the mighty hegemony leaned forward in his seat. His purple skin gleamed under the dome lights, and his 4 arms crossed in front of his massive chest. The hegemony controlled over 200 star systems, and their military was considered one of the strongest in the Galaxy. Vex Tar had already made his opinion of humans clear during the pre-meeting discussions, calling them young and inexperienced. Ambassador Quinn from the Trade Federation sat nearby, her tentacles moving in slow patterns that Kim Day recognized as signs of amusement. The Trade Federation might focus on commerce, but their private security fleets were larger than most government navies. Quinn had openly laughed when she heard that Earth wanted to share military knowledge with civilizations that had been fighting wars since before humans discovered fire. The holographic display activated above Kim Day, showing the Earth military seal, a simple design of a blue planet surrounded by stars. Kim Day began his presentation by explaining how human warfare had evolved on their home world. He talked about the long history of conflict on Earth and how it had shaped their approach to military strategy. The alien audience listened politely at first, but Kim Day could see their attention beginning to wander when he described human tactics. Most galactic military doctrines followed similar patterns. Large fleets would meet in open space and engage in direct combat using advanced energy shields and powerful weapons, the side with superior technology, and numbers usually won. These battles could last for days, with both fleets trading devastating blows until one side retreated or was destroyed. Kim Day explained that humans approached warfare differently. Instead of relying solely on superior firepower, they used speed, mobility, and deception to confuse and outmaneuver their enemies. Human forces would attack from unexpected directions, use the environment to their advantage, and employ psychological warfare to break enemy morale before the actual fighting began. The first signs of open mockery began when Kim Day described guerrilla tactics. Counselor Zeph from the Military Alliance actually stood up and interrupted the presentation. His voice boomed across the chamber as he questioned how hiding and running away could be considered a valid military strategy. The Military Alliance had never lost a direct engagement in over 500 years, and Zeph seemed personally offended by the suggestion that avoiding direct combat could be effective. Other council members began joining the criticism. Ambassador Roth, from the Science Collective, pointed out that human technology was primitive compared to galactic standards. How could inferior weapons and ships hope to succeed against advanced alien forces Fleet Commander Nix from the Border Worlds questioned whether humans had ever actually won a real war, or if they were just sharing theoretical ideas that had never been tested. Kim Day tried to continue his presentation, but the interruptions became more frequent and more hostile. Vextar began making jokes about human cowardice, suggesting that only weak species needed to rely on tricks instead of honest combat. Quinn added her own commentary about how the galaxy had managed quite well for thousands of years without human input on military matters. The mockery reached its peak when Kim Day began explaining the concept of asymmetric warfare. He described how smaller human forces could defeat larger enemies by targeting key weaknesses and using unconventional methods to level the playing field. The alien representatives found this concept hilarious. Several species had tried similar approaches in the past and had been quickly crushed by opponents with superior resources. Counselor Vextar stood up again, his massive frame casting a shadow over the speaking platform. He declared that the hegemony had faced countless enemies who tried to use cunning instead of strength. All of them had eventually been defeated when faced with overwhelming firepower and advanced defensive systems. The galaxy had learned long ago that there was no substitute for technological superiority and tactical discipline. The criticism continued for over an hour, with different council members taking turns to point out flaws in human military thinking. Fleet Commander Nix suggested that Earth should focus on learning from established galactic powers instead of trying to reinvent warfare. Ambassador Roth recommended that humans study at the military academies of more advanced civilizations before attempting to contribute their own ideas. Kim Day felt the weight of hundreds of skeptical stares as the mockery continued. He had expected some resistance, but the level of dismissal surprised him. These alien civilizations had achieved incredible technological advances and controlled vast territories. Their confidence in their military systems was understandable, but their refusal to consider alternative approaches seemed dangerous. The turning point came when Counselor Zeph from the Military Alliance made a proposal that would change everything. He suggested that Earth should prove the effectiveness of their military doctrine through practical demonstration rather than theoretical discussion. The Military Alliance had been dealing with a troublesome rebel group called the Shadow Collective for over 2 years. The Shadow Collective had been terrorizing the Outer Rim territories, attacking merchant convoys and establishing illegal bases in contested systems. 3 different council fleets had been sent to eliminate the rebels, but all had failed to achieve decisive victory. The rebels seemed to disappear whenever major forces approached, only to reappear and launch new attacks from unexpected directions. Zeph proposed that Earth should be given the opportunity to deal with the Shadow Collective using their unconventional military tactics. If human forces succeeded where established, galactic powers had failed. Then perhaps their ideas deserved serious consideration. If they failed, as Zeph clearly expected, then Earth would need to accept that their military concepts were inadequate for galactic warfare. The proposal sent a wave of excitement through the council chamber. Many representatives seemed pleased with the idea of watching the upstart humans fail spectacularly. Ambassador Quinn suggested that failure should result in Earth losing their council membership entirely, while Vextar proposed that successful human commanders should be required to serve under hegemony supervision for proper military education. Kim Day realized that this was both an opportunity and a trap. The Shadow Collective had proven capable of evading and defeating conventional galactic forces, If Earth succeeded, they would gain the respect and recognition they needed. If they failed, their credibility would be destroyed, and their position in the galactic community would become precarious. Despite the obvious risks, Kim Day accepted the challenge without hesitation. He knew that Earth had been preparing for exactly this kind of test since joining the galactic community. Human military leaders had studied alien warfare extensively and had developed strategies specifically designed to surprise and confuse opponents who relied on conventional tactics. The council chamber erupted in surprised murmurs at Kim Day acceptance. Most representatives had expected him to decline or ask for time to consider the proposal. Instead, the human admiral stood calmly at the speaking platform and declared that Earth forces would eliminate the Shadow Collective within 60 standard days. Counselor Zeph smiled with satisfaction as the formal challenge was recorded in the council archives. He was already planning the follow-up discussion where Earth representatives would have to explain their inevitable failure. The galaxy would finally see that human military doctrine was nothing more than primitive barbarism dressed up with fancy words. Kim Day left the council chamber knowing that the future of humanity position among the stars now depended on proving that unconventional warfare could succeed where traditional methods had failed. The mockery would continue until human forces demonstrated the true power of tactics that the galaxy had never seen before. General Park Min stood in the underground war room beneath Seoul, staring at the massive holographic display that showed the Outer Rim territories where the Shadow Collective operated. The room buzzed with activity as dozens of military analysts worked at their stations preparing for the most important mission in human history. Park Min had been chosen to lead this operation because of his reputation for thinking outside traditional military boundaries. The team assembled around the central table represented the best of Earth military leadership. Colonel Lee Na entered first, her small frame hiding the fact that she had never failed a stealth mission in 15 years of service. Her expertise in infiltration and reconnaissance would be crucial for gathering intelligence on rebel positions. Commander Cho Jun arrived next, carrying data tablets filled with electronic warfare protocols. His ability to disrupt enemy communications had saved countless human lives during the Mars Rebellion. Captain Han Sol was the last to join the meeting, his rapid deployment teams having just returned from training exercises in the asteroid belt. Han Sol specialized in fast-moving operations that could strike multiple targets simultaneously. Before disappearing into space, his forces used modified fighters that were faster and more maneuverable than anything in the galactic standard. Arsenal Park Min began the briefing by explaining what they faced. The Shadow Collective had been active for over 3 years, gradually building their strength while avoiding direct confrontation with Council forces. The rebels controlled dozens of hidden bases throughout the Kepler sector, using the natural cover of asteroid fields and nebula clouds. To avoid detection, their ships were a mixture of stolen Council vessels and modified civilian craft, making them difficult to identify and track. The previous Council attempts to eliminate the Shadow Collective had all followed the same basic strategy. Large battle fleets would enter the sector and begin systematic searches of suspected rebel hideouts. When contact was made, the Council forces would attempt to destroy the enemy through overwhelming firepower. The rebels had learned to expect these tactics and had developed countermeasures that allowed them to escape before taking serious damage. Colonel Lee Na studied the tactical reports from failed Council operations and immediately identified the fundamental problem: the alien commanders were thinking like military academy graduates, following textbook procedures that any competent enemy could predict. Human forces would need to approach the problem from a completely different angle, using methods that the rebels would never expect. Human fleet being assembled for this mission looked nothing like the massive dreadnoughts and carrier groups favored by galactic powers. Instead of a few large ships, Earth was preparing dozens of smaller vessels, each designed for specific tactical roles. The main combat ships were modified, destroyers equipped with experimental cloaking technology and enhanced electronic warfare. Suites, Commander Cho Jun explained his electronic warfare strategy to the assembled officers. Instead of jamming enemy communications in the obvious way that Council forces typically used, human ships would intercept and redirect rebel messages. The Shadow Collective would receive false orders that appeared to come from their own commanders, creating confusion and mistrust within their organization. The cloaking technology being installed on human ships was unlike anything used by galactic militaries. Most alien cloaking devices worked by bending light around a vessel, making it invisible to optical sensors. Human engineers had developed a different approach that fooled multiple types of detection systems simultaneously, including the gravitic sensors that most alien ships relied on for navigation. Captain Han Sol outlined his rapid deployment strategy, using small fighter squadrons that could appear anywhere in the sector within minutes. Traditional galactic tactics assumed that military forces would announce their presence and engage in formal battle. Human fighters would strike without warning, from unexpected directions, before disappearing back into the void. The training program developed for this mission challenged every assumption about space combat that human pilots had learned from studying alien military manuals. Instead of flying in neat formations and following predetermined attack patterns, they practiced chaos warfare where every pilot made independent decisions based on rapidly changing battlefield conditions. Parkman emphasized that success would depend on making the enemy afraid and confused rather than simply destroying their ships. The Shadow Collective had survived against superior Council forces by being unpredictable. Human forces would defeat them by being even more unpredictable while using psychological pressure to break their will to fight. The logistics of the operation required complete secrecy from the galactic community. Earth could not afford to have alien observers analyzing their tactics and sharing intelligence with future enemies. Communication with the Council would be handled through Admiral Kim Dae, who would remain on Earth during the actual fighting. Li Na presented intelligence gathered from human merchants and traders who had operated in the Outer Rim territories. For years, these civilian sources provided information that Council military intelligence had never collected because they focused on obvious military targets instead of understanding the human networks that connected different parts of the galaxy. Weapon systems being deployed with the human fleet included several experimental technologies that had never been tested in actual combat. Human engineers had developed new types of missiles that could change course multiple times during flight, making them nearly impossible to intercept. They had also created electronic viruses that could infect alien computer systems and cause critical failures at crucial moments. Cho Jun explained how psychological warfare would be integrated into every aspect of the operation. Human forces would leave mysterious messages at battle sites, written in ancient Earth languages that alien computers could not translate. The rebels would waste time and resources trying to decode these messages instead of focusing on military preparations. The command structure for the human fleet deliberately avoided the rigid hierarchy used by galactic militaries. Every ship captain had been trained to operate independently and make tactical decisions without waiting for orders from higher command. This flexibility would allow human forces to respond instantly to changing situations while alien forces were still requesting permission to act. Han Solo described the false retreat tactics that would be used. To draw rebel forces into carefully prepared ambushes, human ships would appear to flee from superior enemy numbers, leading the Shadow Collective into areas where additional human forces waited in concealment. The rebels would believe they were winning until the trap closed around them. Park Min concluded the briefing by reminding everyone that they were not just fighting for military victory, but for humanity's place in the galactic community. Failure would mean that Earth would be seen as weak and primitive for generations. Success would prove that human military thinking could contribute something valuable to galactic civilization. The final preparations took 6 weeks as human forces practiced coordination between different ship types and refined their unconventional tactics. The fleet that finally departed for the Outer Rim looked small and insignificant compared to the massive Council armadas that had failed before them. But Park Min knew that appearance could be deceiving, and that the Shadow Collective was about to face an enemy unlike anything they had encountered. Colonel Li Na left first with her reconnaissance teams to begin gathering detailed intelligence on rebel movements. Commander Cho Jun deployed his electronic warfare ships to establish listening posts throughout the sector. Captain Han Solo prepared his rapid response squadrons for immediate deployment once the main operation began. The stage was set for a confrontation that would shock the entire galaxy. The human fleet arrived in the Kepler sector during the dark period when the local star was obscured by a massive dust cloud that provided natural cover for their approach. Captain Han Solo watched from the bridge of his command ship as dozens of smaller vessels spread out through the asteroid fields like hunting wolves seeking prey. The rebels had no idea that death was already moving through their territory. Colonel Li Na infiltration teams had been operating in the sector for 2 weeks, gathering intelligence on Shadow Collective movements and identifying key rebel leaders. Through careful observation, they had mapped the enemy supply routes and communication networks that kept the rebel organization functioning. The information they collected revealed weaknesses that no Council force had ever discovered. The first sign that something was different came when rebel patrol ships began disappearing without sending distress signals. The Shadow Collective leadership assumed these losses were due to equipment failures or accidents in the dangerous asteroid environment. They had no way of knowing that human stealth teams were systematically eliminating isolated enemy vessels and capturing their crews for interrogation. Commander Cho Jun electronic warfare specialists had established hidden monitoring stations throughout the sector that intercepted every rebel communication. The human teams learned the enemy operational codes, recognition signals, and patrol schedules within. Days' information that had taken Council intelligence months to gather was collected by human forces in a fraction of the time. The Shadow Collective had grown confident after years of successful operations against Council forces. Their bases were well hidden, but not well defended, because previous enemies had been unable to locate them. The rebels assumed that superior concealment was adequate protection against the predictable search patterns used by alien military forces. Human forces began their active operations by targeting rebel supply convoys that traveled between hidden bases. Li Na stealth squadrons would track these convoys from a distance, learning their routes and schedules before striking at the most vulnerable moments. The attacks came without warning from multiple directions, leaving no survivors to report what had happened. The psychological impact of these losses began affecting rebel morale within the first week. Shadow Collective commanders could not understand how their carefully planned supply runs were being intercepted. The rebels increased security measures and changed routes, but the attacks continued with deadly precision. Human forces seemed to know where enemy ships would be before the rebels themselves had decided on their destinations. Captain Han Sol rapid deployment teams perfected the art of appearing and disappearing like ghosts in space. Their modified fighters could accelerate faster than most alien sensors could track, allowing them to strike targets and escape before enemy reinforcements arrived. The rebels began reporting attacks by unknown vessels that seemed to violate the laws of physics. The first major engagement occurred when a Shadow Collective raiding party attempted to attack a civilian transport near the sector boundary. The rebels expected an easy victory against the lightly armed merchant vessel, but human forces had been tracking the raiding party for days and were waiting in ambush positions throughout the area. When the rebel ships moved to attack the transport, they found themselves surrounded by human fighters that seemed to materialize from empty space. Li Na had positioned her stealth squadrons in a three-dimensional web that allowed them to attack from above, below, and all sides simultaneously. The rebel formation collapsed within minutes as confused enemy pilots tried to fight opponents they could barely detect. Instead of destroying the defeated rebel ships, human forces disabled them with precision strikes that left the crews alive but helpless. The captured rebels were interrogated using psychological techniques that broke their resistance without physical torture. Within hours, the human teams had extracted detailed information about Shadow Collective base locations, command structures, and future operational plans. The intelligence gathered from captured rebels revealed that the Shadow Collective leadership was beginning to panic. The mysterious attacks had disrupted their supply lines and communications, while the loss of experienced crews was weakening their combat effectiveness. Rebel commanders were starting to suspect that some of their own people might be working as spies for the Council. Commander Cho Jun took advantage of this growing paranoia by using intercepted communication codes to send false messages between different rebel cells. The Shadow Collective began receiving contradictory orders that appeared to come from their own leadership. Some cells were told to abandon their bases, while others were ordered to prepare for major operations that never materialized. The confusion created by these false communications caused several rebel groups to attack each other, believing they were fighting Council infiltrators. Human electronic warfare specialists watched with satisfaction as the enemy organization began tearing itself apart from within. The Shadow Collective was defeating itself, while human forces remained almost invisible. Park Min monitored the operation from his command ship positioned at the edge of the sector, where it could coordinate activities without being detected by rebel sensors. The early success of the mission had exceeded his expectations, but he knew that the most dangerous phase was still ahead. The Shadow Collective leadership would eventually realize they were facing a completely new type of enemy. The rebels attempted to regain control of the situation by launching coordinated attacks against suspected human positions. But Li Na stealth teams had anticipated this response and had prepared false targets that appeared to be human bases. The Shadow Collective wasted ammunition and fuel attacking empty locations, while the real human forces remained. Hidden Han Sol rapid response squadrons began appearing at multiple locations, simultaneously creating the impression that human forces were far larger than they actually were. The rebels received reports of enemy contact from dozens of different areas, making it impossible to determine the true size and location of the human fleet. The psychological pressure on Shadow Collective forces continued to increase as human attacks became more frequent and more unpredictable. Rebel pilots began reporting sightings of ghost ships that appeared on sensors for brief moments before disappearing again. The stress of fighting an invisible enemy was breaking down the discipline and cohesion that had made the rebels effective against Council forces. By the end of the third week, human forces had eliminated over half of the Shadow Collective operational capability without engaging in a single major battle. The rebels were running low on supplies while their communication networks had been thoroughly compromised. The once confident rebel organization was beginning to collapse under the weight of constant pressure and uncertainty. Colonel Lee Na reported that rebel morale had reached a critical breaking point. Several Shadow Collective cells had abandoned their positions and fled the sector, while others were requesting permission to surrender. The enemy leadership was struggling to maintain control over their remaining forces as fear and suspicion spread through the organization. Hunt was nearing its conclusion, but Park Min knew that the most important phase was still to come. The remaining Shadow Collective forces would soon be desperate enough to attempt one final massive attack. Human forces would need to be ready to spring the ultimate trap that would end the rebellion once and for all. The Shadow Collective leadership gathered in their main command base, hidden deep within the Titan Nebula, where the swirling gases made sensor detection nearly impossible. Warlord Crix paced angrily across the metal floor while his remaining commanders sat around the holographic display showing their rapidly shrinking territory. Over half their forces had vanished in the past month, without a trace. Commander Vash nervously reported the latest losses, including 3 supply convoys and an entire patrol squadron that had disappeared between the 4th and 5th asteroid clusters. The rebels could not understand how their hidden routes were being discovered when they had successfully used the same paths for years without Council forces finding them. The mysterious enemy seemed to know everything about Shadow Collective operations, including their communication codes, recognition signals, and secret meeting locations. Crick suspected that someone within his organization was providing intelligence to the Council, but interrogating suspected traitors had revealed nothing. Several loyal commanders had been executed based on false evidence. What terrified the rebels most were the strange messages left at attack sites written in symbols that no alien computer system could translate. The messages appeared to be warnings or threats, but their meaning remained unknown. Shadow Collective researchers had spent weeks trying to decode the mysterious writing without success. Commander Cho Jun watched from his electronic warfare station as rebel communications became increasingly frantic and disorganized. The false intelligence his teams were feeding into enemy networks was creating exactly the paranoia and confusion that human psychologists had predicted the Shadow Collective was beginning to destroy itself from within. The psychological campaign intensified when human forces began leaving physical evidence at battle sites that seemed impossible to explain. Rebel investigators found metal fragments made from alloys that did not exist in any known database. Strange energy readings suggested the use of weapons technology that violated accepted scientific principles. Lee Na stealth teams had been planting these fake artifacts for weeks using materials manufactured specifically to confuse alien scientists. The fragments contained isotopes that appeared to be millions of years old, while the energy signatures matched no known power source. The rebels wasted valuable resources trying to analyze evidence that had been designed to lead them nowhere. The most effective psychological weapon was the complete unpredictability of human attacks. Shadow Collective forces never knew when or where the next strike would come. Some Rebel ships were destroyed instantly while others were disabled and their crews allowed to escape. The survivors spread stories about ghostly enemies who could appear and disappear at will. Captain Han Sol refined these terror tactics by ensuring that some attacks left no evidence, while others left obvious signs of human presence. The rebels could never determine if they were fighting one enemy or many. The psychological pressure of facing an opponent who seemed to control reality itself was breaking down their will to fight. Warlord Crix attempted to regain control by ordering all remaining forces to concentrate at the main base where their combined firepower could destroy any attacking force. But human intelligence networks had been tracking this gathering for days, and Park Min was already preparing the final phase of his campaign. The rebels received false communications that appeared to come from their own scouts, reporting massive council fleets approaching from multiple directions. Crix believed his base was about to be attacked by overwhelming forces and ordered an immediate evacuation. The Shadow Collective abandoned their strongest position based on intelligence that existed only in human computer systems. Commander Vash questioned the evacuation order because no actual enemy ships had been detected, but Crix was too paranoid to trust his own sensors. The warlord had convinced himself that the mysterious enemies possessed technology that could fool any detection system. The rebels fled from their main base, leaving behind valuable equipment and supplies. Human psychological warfare teams had studied the personality profiles of key Shadow Collective leaders and had designed specific campaigns to exploit their individual weaknesses. Crix was naturally suspicious and prone to paranoia, while Vash was cautious and indecisive. The false intelligence fed to each commander was tailored to trigger their worst instincts. The evacuation of the main rebel base created exactly the chaos that Park Min had been waiting for. Shadow Collective forces were scattered across the sector in small groups that could be eliminated separately. The unified command structure that had made the rebels effective was completely broken. infiltration teams began spreading rumors among the fleeing rebels that Crix had made a secret deal with the Council to save himself by betraying his followers. The false evidence supporting this story was so convincing that several rebel commanders began planning to assassinate their own leader. The paranoia reached its peak when Vash received a message that appeared to come from Council intelligence offering him amnesty in exchange for information about Crix's location. The message was actually sent by Cho-Jun electronic warfare specialists, but Vash had no way of knowing this. The rebel commander began seriously considering betraying his leader. Human forces watched with satisfaction as the Shadow Collective tore itself apart without any need for direct military action. The rebels were expending ammunition fighting each other while their supply lines collapsed and their communication networks became completely unreliable. The psychological pressure was so intense that some rebel groups began surrendering to phantom enemies that existed only in their imagination. Human monitoring stations recorded dozens of communications from Shadow Collective cells offering to surrender to forces that were not actually present. Park Min realized that the psychological campaign had been more successful than anyone had expected. The rebels were so thoroughly demoralized that they might surrender without requiring a final battle. But the galactic community expected a dramatic conclusion that would demonstrate human military superiority. The decision was made to allow the remaining Shadow Collective forces to attempt one final desperate attack. Human intelligence networks began feeding information to the rebels, suggesting that the mysterious enemies had a vulnerable command base that could be destroyed with sufficient force Crick seized on this apparent opportunity to strike back against the enemies who had destroyed his organization. The warlord began, gathering his remaining ships for what he planned as a decisive victory that would restore Shadow collective power in the sector. The trap was being set, but the rebels had no idea that they were walking into the final phase of a psychological warfare campaign that had been designed from the beginning to manipulate their every decision. The Shadow Collective believed they were planning their own attack when they were actually following a script written by human military psychologists. Warlord Crix stood on the bridge of his flagship staring at the tactical display that showed the largest gathering of Shadow Collective forces in over 2 years. Nearly every surviving rebel ship had answered his call for the final assault against what appeared to be the main enemy command base. The intelligence report suggested that destroying this facility would cripple the mysterious forces that had been hunting them. The target was a small moon in the outer system that seemed to be lightly defended by only a handful of enemy vessels. Rebel scouts had confirmed the presence of what looked like command and control facilities, along with supply depots and communication arrays. The base appeared vulnerable to a concentrated attack by superior numbers. Commander Vash felt uneasy about the operation, despite the apparent opportunity. Something about the intelligence seemed too convenient, but he could not identify specific problems with the reconnaissance reports. The rebel fleet included over 60 ships ranging from converted freighters to stolen Council destroyers, representing nearly all of their remaining combat power. Colonel Li Na watched from her concealed position as the Shadow Collective fleet began moving toward their doom. The apparent command base was actually an elaborate deception created by human engineering teams working around the clock for 3 weeks. The visible installations were unmanned decoys designed to attract exactly this kind of attack. The real human fleet was spread throughout the surrounding space in carefully planned positions that would allow them to attack from every direction. Simultaneously, Park Min had spent days studying the tactical situation and had positioned his forces. To create an inescapable trap, the rebels were about to discover what happened when they faced opponents who understood three-dimensional warfare. Captain Han Sol rapid deployment squadrons were hidden within the asteroid field that surrounded the target moon. Their ships were powered down and running silent, making them invisible to rebel sensors. The fighters would emerge from concealment at the moment of maximum surprise when the enemy fleet was committed to the attack. Commander Cho Jun had prepared the ultimate electronic warfare surprise for the Shadow Collective fleet. When the rebels began their attack, human systems would simultaneously jam all enemy communications while broadcasting false sensor data that would make friendly ships appear as enemies. The rebel fleet would begin attacking itself within minutes of entering the kill zone. The Shadow Collective approached the target with confidence born of desperation. Crix believed that destroying the enemy command base would restore rebel power in the sector and force the mysterious opponents to retreat. The warlord had no idea that every aspect of the operation had been anticipated and prepared for by human tactical planners. Park Min waited until the rebel fleet had passed the point of no return before giving the attack order. The apparent enemy command base suddenly revealed itself to be a collection of decoys and holograms, while the real human fleet materialized from concealment like vengeful spirits, rising from the depths of space. The battle began with devastating effectiveness as human forces attacked from directions that the rebels had not even considered possible. Li Na stealth squadrons emerged from behind the target moon, while Han Sol fighters rose from the asteroid field. Commander Cho Jun electronic warfare created chaos in rebel communications, as false targeting data made enemy ships fire on each other. Warlord Crix watched in horror as his carefully planned assault turned into a massacre. Within minutes, the enemy fleet seemed to be everywhere at once, while his own ships were reporting target locks on vessels that should have been allies. The Shadow Collective formation collapsed as panicked pilots tried to avoid both human attacks and friendly fire. The psychological impact of the ambush was as devastating as the physical damage. Rebel crews who had been terrorized for weeks by invisible enemies suddenly found themselves surrounded by opponents who seemed to possess supernatural powers. The will to fight evaporated as quickly as their tactical formation. Commander Vash attempted to organize a fighting retreat, but the human trap had been designed to prevent any escape routes. The rebel fleet was caught in a three-dimensional web of crossfire that eliminated any possibility of organized withdrawal. Individual ships that tried to flee were hunted down by Han Sol. Rapid response teams. The electronic warfare assault reached its climax when Cho Jun systems began broadcasting surrender demands in the voices of dead rebel commanders. The psychological effect was devastating as demoralized Shadow Collective crews heard their former leaders ordering them to give up the fight from beyond the grave. Park Min monitored the battle from his command position and was amazed by the complete effectiveness of human tactics. The engagement that alien military experts had expected to last for days was effectively over within 2 hours. The Shadow Collective fleet was either destroyed, captured, or fleeing in complete disarray. Crix made one final desperate attempt to salvage victory by ordering his flagship to ram the apparent enemy command base. But Li Na teams had anticipated even this possibility, and the base exploded in a brilliant firework display that had been designed to look impressive while causing no actual damage to human forces. The warlord realized too late that he had been manipulated from the beginning. The intelligence that led to this attack had been provided by his enemies. The base was a fake, and his fleet had been led into a trap that no military academy in the galaxy would have recognized as possible. The rebels had been defeated by tactics that did not exist in any textbook. Commander Vash survived the battle by surrendering his ship when it became clear that resistance was hopeless. His crew was grateful to be captured alive after witnessing the destruction of so many other rebel vessels. The psychological warfare had been so effective that many Shadow Collective survivors actually thanked their captors for ending the nightmare. The few rebel ships that escaped the ambush scattered throughout the galaxy, carrying stories about the impossible battle they had witnessed. The Shadow Collective as an organized military force had been completely eliminated, but the survivors would spread tales about human tactical abilities that would terrify potential enemies for generations. Park Min surveyed the battlefield with satisfaction, knowing that human forces had achieved something that 3 Council fleets had failed to accomplish. The Shadow Collective had been destroyed not through superior firepower or advanced technology, but through psychological manipulation and tactical innovation that the galaxy had never seen before. The victory was complete, but Park Min knew that the real test would come when news of the battle reached the Galactic Council. The alien representatives who had mocked human military doctrine would soon learn that Earth forces could accomplish the impossible using methods that challenged every assumption about modern warfare. Captain Han Sol reported minimal human casualties, with only 3 fighters damaged and no personnel lost. The Shadow Collective had suffered devastating losses while human forces remained almost untouched. The tactical superiority demonstrated in this engagement would reshape galactic thinking about military strategy for centuries to come. The trap had closed perfectly, and the rebels who had terrorized the Outer Rim for years had been eliminated by an enemy they never understood. The galaxy was about to discover that human military doctrine was not primitive barbarism, but a sophisticated approach to warfare that could defeat any opponent regardless of their technological advantages. The first reports of the Shadow Collective destruction reached the Galactic Council through routine intelligence channels, but the initial information was so incredible that most representatives dismissed it as exaggerated propaganda. Admiral Kim Day received the official communication from Park Min confirming total victory, but he waited for independent verification before making any announcements. Counselor Vex Tar from the Hegemony was reviewing standard military briefings when his intelligence staff presented evidence that human forces had somehow eliminated the rebel threat that had defied Council authority for over 3 years. The purple-skinned aliens stared at the tactical reports in disbelief, unable to understand how primitive Earth technology could succeed where advanced galactic fleets had failed. Ambassador Quinn from the Trade Federation received similar reports from her merchant contacts who operated in the Outer Rim territories. The rebel attacks that had been costing the Federation millions of credits in lost cargo had suddenly stopped completely. Independent sources confirmed that Shadow Collective bases throughout the sector had been abandoned or destroyed. The breakthrough came when Fleet Commander Nix from the Border Worlds obtained recordings from automated monitoring stations that had observed the final battle. The footage showed human ships appearing and disappearing like ghosts, while rebel forces fired wildly at targets they could not properly identify. The engagement lasted less than 2 hours and resulted in complete Shadow Collective defeat. Counselor Zeph from the Military Alliance was the first to demand a full investigation into human tactics. The alien commander who had originally challenged Earth to prove their military doctrine now faced the uncomfortable reality that his own forces had been humiliated by opponents he had considered inferior. The Military Alliance had never experienced such a decisive defeat. Emergency sessions were called at military academies throughout the galaxy as instructors struggled to understand how established tactical doctrines had been rendered obsolete. The textbooks that had guided galactic warfare for centuries suddenly seemed inadequate when faced with human innovation. Admiral Kim Day began receiving requests for detailed explanations of Earth military methods. The psychological impact of human victory extended far beyond military circles. Trade routes that had been abandoned due to rebel activity suddenly reopened as merchants realized the threat had been permanently eliminated. Civilian shipping companies began requesting human escorts for their convoys, believing that Earth forces could provide protection. That Council fleets could not guarantee, intelligence services across the galaxy began frantically analyzing any available information about human military capabilities. The same alien governments that had mocked Earth doctrine now desperately wanted to understand how such devastating effectiveness had been achieved. Species that had ignored humanity for decades suddenly viewed Earth as a potential threat or valuable ally partner. Min returned to Earth as a hero, but his greatest satisfaction came from knowing that human military thinking had gained respect throughout the civilized galaxy. The tactical methods developed on Earth through centuries of conflict had proven superior to the standardized approaches taught at alien military institutions. Interrogation of captured Shadow Collective personnel revealed the full extent of human psychological warfare capabilities. Rebel survivors described weeks of terror and confusion as they faced opponents who seemed to possess supernatural knowledge and abilities. The stories spread throughout the galactic underworld, warning criminal organizations about the dangers of confronting human forces. Military contractors from advanced civilizations began approaching Earth with offers to purchase human, tactical expertise. The same species that had dismissed human warfare as primitive now wanted to hire Earth advisors to train their own forces in unconventional combat methods. Admiral Kim Day found himself invited to lecture at prestigious military academies, where alien cadets studied human tactics with the same intensity they had once reserved for advanced technology courses. The presentation that had been mocked months earlier was now required reading at institutions throughout the galaxy. Commander Cho-Jun electronic warfare techniques became the subject of intensive study as alien intelligence agencies realized they had been completely unprepared for information manipulation on such a sophisticated level. The psychological operations that had destroyed the Shadow Collective from within represented a new form of warfare that most species had never encountered. Colonel Lee Na's stealth and infiltration methods challenged fundamental assumptions about military reconnaissance that had remained unchanged for thousands of years. The ability of human forces to gather intelligence while remaining completely undetected forced a complete reevaluation of security procedures throughout the galaxy. Captain Han Sol's rapid deployment strategies demonstrated the tactical advantages of flexibility and independent decision-making over the rigid command structures favored by most alien militaries. Military planners began experimenting with decentralized command systems that allowed individual units to respond instantly to changing battlefield conditions. The Galactic Council formally recognized Earth military contributions with the establishment of a new Strategic Innovation Committee dedicated to studying unconventional warfare methods. Admiral Kim Day was appointed as the first human representative to this prestigious body, giving Earth a permanent voice in galactic military planning. Trade agreements that had been stalled for years suddenly received approval as alien governments sought to establish closer relationships with humanity. The economic benefits of military success extended throughout Earth society as interstellar commerce expanded rapidly in response to improved galactic standing. The mockery that had characterized initial alien attitudes toward human warfare was replaced by a mixture of respect and apprehension. Species that had dismissed Earth as primitive newcomers now viewed humanity as potential conquerors whose military capabilities were not fully understood. The galaxy had learned to fear what it did not comprehend. Educational exchange programs were established as alien military officers requested training at Earth institutions, while human cadets received scholarships to study at prestigious galactic academies. The cross-cultural military education that resulted from these programs began influencing tactical development throughout civilized space park. Min established the Human Tactical Institute to preserve and develop the military, innovations that had proven so successful against the Shadow Collective. The institute became a center for strategic research that attracted scholars and military professionals from across the galaxy seeking to understand the principles behind human military effectiveness. The victory in the Kepler sector had consequences that extended far beyond the elimination of a single rebel group. Humanity had demonstrated that technological superiority was not the only path to military success, and that innovative thinking could overcome seemingly impossible odds. The galaxy would never again underestimate the species that had learned warfare in the crucible of their own violent history. Years later, when military historians studied the Shadow Collective campaign, they identified it as the turning point when human military doctrine gained acceptance throughout the civilized galaxy. The tactics developed on Earth through centuries of conflict had proven adaptable to the vast theater of interstellar warfare, creating new possibilities for strategic thinking that would influence galactic military development for generations to come.